Tonight on NationToNation, victory for 60 scoop survivors.
That our children are so valuable and sacred and precious that we will protect them by law.
What's next? And what's in a name? Indigenous MPs push to strip the name of one of residential schools' architects from the building that holds the Prime Minister's office. And the political panel returns to hash out the latest from Ottawa. This is NationToNation. I'm Jorge Barrera. 60 scoop survivors scored a major victory in their 8-year-long Ontario court battle this week. A judge ruled that Ottawa breached its common duty of care by not preventing First Nations children from losing their Indigenous identity after they were placed in non-Indigenous care. Beaverhouse First Nation Chief Marcia Martel was one of these children and became a lead plaintiff in the Ontario court case. Thanks for joining us, Chief Martel.
Miigwech. Thank you.
Tell us a bit about your story.
Well, quite a long while ago, I was a child, 4 or 5 years old, and was taken from my community. I did not return until I was 18. I lost my language in that time period. I lost my way. I lost my way as an individual. I had no culture, no tradition, I was told I was supposed to have these things because I looked like I was a First Nation individual, which I was. However, I had no basis for language, culture. I had no way of avenue of exercising that because I didn't know of it.
And how did you discover it?
When I came back into Canada as Marcia Brown, I had remembered my childhood name, the name that my mother had given me, the name that my father had given me, and I returned into the area of my community, one of my communities of Beaverhouse First Nation, and I didn't fit in. But I knew genetically these were the people that I was part of. I came from this genetic group of people. And I started to see that we looked the same. We had a same language. We had the same kind of thinking because I watched and I learned. And in that, I started to integrate into my community once again. It was hard. It was hard because I didn't do the things they did. I didn't understand their way of life. In time I did. And in time I too followed in with what they do and how they think more in action as well.
And what made you want to take this to the courts and continue the fight?
Well, I had already seen that what we refer to as the Millennium Scoop was still occurring, very similar to what the 60s Scoop was. And it was wrong. It was wrong for this to happen to me as an individual. How could it possibly not be wrong that it would happen to thousands? And when I learned that it happened to thousands upon thousands of children, that I was not alone in that, it was an incredible time. I spent a month just contemplating that. And I realized, yeah, maybe somebody should step forward.
Now that you have a victory, what is it you would like to see happen?
Healing. A change in how the government interacts with First Nations across the country.
And in terms of what you'd like to see, in terms of compensation and things like that, what would you like to see?
I leave those kind of things to the lawyers. However, this piece about Canada acknowledging that cultural identity is a protectionable right that now in Canada you have to acknowledge language, culture, cultural identity. That's huge. It'll change the way our children are being, not just our children, but every child in Canada within the child welfare system, that these things will be acknowledged and then the harm that comes to them will be lessened.
Thank you for joining us, and I guess the future looks a little brighter.
Yes, it does. And we will walk through these coming days with great hope, anticipation, and know that we will come to challenges, but we will see them through.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
When we return, Nation to Nation's MPs panel hashes out the week's issues. This is Nation to Nation. I'm Jorge Barrera. It was a big week with the 60 Scoop ruling and the government's response. But was it enough? And what's in a name? The Prime Minister's office is named after Hector Louis Langevin, one of the architects of residential schools. Indigenous MPs want to change.
Good morning, everyone.
The Nation to Nation political panel is here now to tackle these issues. Joining me now is Yvonne Jones, who's the Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Affairs, Conservative MP Cathy McLeod, and NDP MP Georgina Jolibois. Thank you so much for joining us this week for the Nation to Nation political panel. Well, there was big news this week, and it was the decision on the 60 Scoop. Your government, Indigenous Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett, said in the House that there's not going to be an appeal and work will begin on finding some sort of negotiated settlement. But then, you know, there was some statements made outside the House that made people think, well, maybe there's a little bit of hedging bets here. There's a people are suggesting there's a possibility of a limited appeal or looking for some sort of limited appeal to limit the fallout of this ruling and the possible compensation order. I'm just wondering, are these critics or worries bounded?
The government has made a decision, as was indicated by the Minister, that we would not be appealing. In fact, over a week ago, we did ask for a negotiated agreement with all the parties involved. That's the preferred route that government wanted, and that's the route that we will take. We know that the suffering of many of these people have went on for far too long, and that it needs to be settled, and healing needs to take place. That can only happen once there is a negotiated agreement between all parties. All parties have been invited to the table with the Government of Canada to settle this process, and we can only hope that they will all engage at this stage. And based on the fact that the courts have ruled in the case of Ontario, and I think that that ruling is accepted, I know, by the Government of Canada, and we want to be able to move forward with negotiated settlements for all other parties that are involved. It is the preferred route. I think it is the route that will work best for all involved, not just the Government of Canada, but for those that are in the courts as well. And we also know that a lot of the healing that needs to take place and the restorative programs around language and culture that people are asking for is not going to be dealt with through a court ruling. These things will get dealt with through negotiation and through programs that are designed by communities and First Nations themselves to meet the need of what their people are asking for.
Cathy, how do you feel that this government has been handling this tail end of the 60 Scoop saga so far?
So the 60 Scoop, of course, is another dark part of our history, like the residential school. It's kind of bizarre. If you look at the government going to try and, it almost seemed like they were trying to avoid the court judgment. I mean, they were at the nth hour, and it was an unusual thing for the lawyers to independently go to the judge and say we want to negotiate. I mean, that is not a typical process. So I'm really not sure whether the left hand, right hand were talking, but it certainly was inappropriate, and a lot of people indicated that that was an inappropriate move. We now have a court decision. They need to move forward, not only, of course, with the group in Ontario, but there's cases that are across Canada. So let's see their next steps. But it was a very sort of a bizarre sort of sequence of events, and it seemed like they were trying to avoid the ruling.
Yeah, there was a lot of movement. You had Minister Bennett, get up and say we want to negotiate a settlement while it was still before the courts, and the next day the Justice Canada lawyers continued, and then yes, they did try to preempt that ruling. Georgina, I'm just wondering, what would you like to see in terms of the type of settlement negotiations that the Liberals are saying they're going to enter into? What would you like to see?
Before I get to that point, I want to clarify. I don't know if the Conservatives would have moved another way other than the court process too. Well, the history proves that there's no faith in that area also. But the Liberals, I like to thank the Liberals for inviting the NDP. I know my colleague Romeo Saganash and I will participate when invited and provide suggestions and recommendations and do our part. The 60 Scoop, again, is a horrible history, part of the horrible history. So far, the Liberal government has not moved on some key various First Nations and Métis and Indigenous issues across Canada. It's really sad to hear that it had gone to court, and it's really nice to know that a decision, the court ruled in favor of the victims and sided with the victims. Now, the next question that we would have, is how long will the mitigation take? The history thus far, the UNDRIP implementation and adoption of the bill has not occurred. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the recommendations were the Prime Minister wholeheartedly campaigned on and has not implemented or adopted either. They're taking their sweet time when it comes to building that nation-to-nation relationship, and it's hurting the victims, and that's what I worry, that the mitigation will take forever.
Yvonne, two different types of allegations on this issue. One, that you guys were a little scattered on handling this, that maybe Justice and Indigenous Affairs weren't communicating, and the other one is the way you're handling this is not in the spirit of reconciliation. How do you respond to that?
Well, I totally disagree. We are the government that have been consistent in removing cases from the courts in the last year. We've been here a year, or a little over a year. The former government chose litigation, always, against Indigenous people. We have chosen negotiation. The Minister, myself, and others worked very hard in our government to seek a mandate from the Government of Canada that was opposite to what the Harper mandate was, and that was to remove this case from the courts and settle it out of court. That mandate was granted to the Minister. That's the reason she went forward exactly when she did, because she had been granted that mandate under Cabinet to be able to do the settlement and to do the process. By all means, you had 10 years and you kept it in the courts.
Sometimes there's a place for negotiation, and sometimes there's a place to
it's
do it.
Unfortunate your government could not find a negotiation
No, just a second.
place.
There is a time, had we not had Sparrow, had we not had Delgamoot, had we not had the Silcoteen decision, it would be up to the whims of separate governments. So when you go through the courts, there are times where it gives decisions that last a lifetime,
well,
generations.
All those decisions were there when you were in government, and you ignored them. So don't talk out about
just sides
your
just a second. What we're
you
talking
ignored
about,
them. You challenged every single case in the courts. Your government did every case.
There is,
including the tribunal that you're talking about today.
There is a place for the courts, and the courts, in many, many ways, have given a lot of good resolutions to issues, and they're resolutions that stand the test of time.
Well, you guys should know they overruled the government every time when you guys were in
government.
Well, so you should know their decisions were the right ones.
Okay, Georgina, you want to jump in?
They have not moved. The Liberals in the government have not moved on any of the important files that the Indigenous people are really waiting for.
Not true. Not true.
Well,
Georgina,
there is an issue where both the Liberals and the NDP seem to be on the right side, on the same side, but I didn't see any conservative signatures on the letter that's going to Minister Judy Foote about changing Langevin block. The Indigenous Caucus supports it. Kathy, where's the Conservative signature?
Well, first of all, they didn't actually come to us in terms of what our opinion was. The one question I have is, did the Indigenous Caucus talk to the Métis? Did they get a formal sort of response to the Métis? Now, I understand that Langevin is a very dark part of the history, the name in terms of for First Nations. But he has a checkered past, so he was also very strongly supportive in terms of Louis Riel, from my understanding historically. So I'm not objecting, but have they asked the Métis people of Canada how they feel about this decision?
The information that I have thus far is that the AFN, the Métis Nation of Canada, the Council, and the various the women's groups across Canada and the other ones, they've been consulted and they've signed on apparently. And
but with this one,
they're talking. However,
this issue was raised by Natan Obed first from ITK. President of ITK was the first one to raise this issue in Canada about 3 weeks ago. Mr. Bellegarde has supported it since then. I have not seen anything from the Métis, I have to say. But apparently in the discussions with the Liberal Indigenous Caucus this past week, I was in the Yukon. I was not able to be at the meeting. They did support the request from Mr. Bellegarde and from Mr. Obed and from Mr. Tutu.
And do you support it?
I do support it. And I did sign also.
Yes.
Romeo
so my only point would be we don't object, but we better make sure that there's been proper consultation with all Indigenous
And I have asked that various questions because it's very important that we are very inclusive of all Indigenous peoples across Canada.
All right. Well, thank you. That's all the time we have. We could have gone deeper into this Langevin. I didn't know there was some. Anyway, so thank you so much for being here, and hopefully we can get you guys together again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Merci, Joe.
When we return, we chat with Cree MP Romeo Saganash. This is Nation to Nation. I'm Jorge Barrera. Cree MP Romeo Saganash is the NDP's Indigenous Affairs critic. About a year ago, Saganash said he wanted to see how the government acted on its promises to Indigenous peoples before passing judgment. He wasn't taking a knee-jerk opposition politician's approach, but what he's seen since has started to concern him. Well, thanks for being here, Romeo.
Pleasure, as always.
So I've been noticing that you seem to be getting a little bit more frustrated with this Liberal government of late. Is this accurate?
I am frustrated because I don't know if you remember, right after the election, one of the things I said, given all their promises and their commitments that they made to Indigenous peoples, that I wouldn't doubt their sincerity at that point. But I had a duty as a member in the opposition to test that sincerity. And that's what I've been doing for the past year and a half. And I'm starting to notice that they're abandoning Indigenous peoples. As always, this has been going on for 150 years. And despite the promise for real change from Justin Trudeau and this Liberal Party, it's not happening. Not with this Indigenous file, not with many other files. Electoral reform is a case in point as well. So, yeah, I'm usually a very patient guy. I've negotiated things that took many years in the past, but it's quite a feat to make Romeo Saganash lose patience.
And I guess one of those examples of the loss of patience was this letter that you sent to Prime Minister Trudeau on February 6th about his statement about how First Nations youth, what they want is sheds to store their canoes and paddles. And you said, I fear we have lost sight of the inadequacy of canoe storage infrastructure. Perhaps we were distracted by the fact that too many First Nations kids have inadequate schools, overcrowded homes, and unequal access to mental and child welfare services. That was pretty biting. What led to you to write a letter like this to the Prime Minister?
A lot of it has to do with Cree humor. And we all have that among Indigenous communities. but also it provided the opportunity to say that was insensitive, ignorant on his part, and also to explain that, hey, there are more urgent, serious, and grave issues in terms of challenges that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities face in this country. And, you know, for a person that said that the most important relationship in this country is with Indigenous communities, for him to say that, that was dumb.
And there's another letter that you've written, and this one is to the Public Services and Procurement Minister, Judy Foote, about changing the name of the Land-Giving Bloc, and Prime Minister Trudeau CC'd on it. Why do you think that Land-Giving Bloc, which is the Prime Minister's office, the working office, which is across Parliament Hill, why do you think the name should be changed?
Well, I think, first of all, the role of Land-Giving in history, and especially related to the history of residential schools, is something to think about when we're talking about that block. And secondly, if we are serious about nation-to-nation relationships, serious about reconciliation, then we need to do something about that as well. It's perhaps symbolic, granted, but I think those are the kind of symbols that we need to continue to push in this country, and that's an easy one.
Because it's named after the architect of residential schools.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's an easy thing to do. If they do it, they'll see it doesn't hurt to do those kind of things.
And the other thing that you've been hammering the government on, we'll end on this one, is 60 Scoop. You know, the minister before the ruling this week had said we're going to negotiate, and then the next day they were still in court litigating. Now they're saying, you know what, we're not going to appeal this ruling. We are going to negotiate some sort of settlement. Do you believe?
Well, I have reason to doubt now, given the record of this government since 18 months. Her answer, I asked the question yesterday in question period directly to the minister, are you going to respect and uphold this ruling and not appeal it? And she was pretty clear about saying that they won't appeal it. A couple of minutes after question period outside of the House, well, she started hesitating about that commitment. So we have to remain vigilant with this government. They talk a lot, but almost no action in terms of their commitments and promises to Indigenous people. So that's worrisome for me. So I'm going to continue playing the role that I have as critic for Aboriginal affairs in the face of this government, and I'm going to continue pushing that they don't appeal this ruling. 8 years in court is long enough for the survivors of the 60 Scoop. And in the first place, they shouldn't be. They should have not been in court for 8 years. So this attitude, this promise for real change, really has to change now.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you'll come back again and tell us how things are going.
Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for Nation to Nation tonight. But join us again next week. I'm Jorge Barrera. Good night.